sovereign wealth funds may have to learn to have the multidisciplinary capability in each of the individual staff.
We have to think for profit going ahead, but we also have to think pro community going ahead.
One's brand when you walked into the room, one's brand when you walk out of the room. You're always trying to come forward with that brand and people recognizing when they deal with you.
How do you build a strategy thinking, the roadmaps, the strategic plans and corporate strategy and so on?
International panel that we've had today, I think we can safely say that, and not a single representative from the United States on the panel. So it's the most international that we have. We're talking about the interactions between family offices and sovereign wealth funds. We're talking about the commonalities, the shared obstacles they face, the solutions that they can adopt. So in no particular order, as I mentioned, I'd like to invite onto the stage Uche Orji. Uche? Uche, as you know, is the former chief executive of the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, Nigeria's Sovereign Wealth Fund. Uche. Thank you very much. Next, to Dr. Anna Nakavaloich. Please join us on stage. Dr. Anna is a research fellow at Kellogg College at the University of Oxford. And then if we can pass over to Jacques Demer.
Okay.
Jacques is the chairman of Agawa Partners. And last but not least, Ambassador Udaya Indraratna, Ambassador of Sri Lanka to the United Arab Emirates. A warm welcome to you all. So given the time constraints, we're more or less going to cut straight to the chase. Clearly there are commonalities, shared timeframes, longer-term horizons between private wealth, family offices, and their counterparts on the public side, the sovereign funds, government funds, and so on. We're focusing on future generations, on the long-term horizons, yet there are important differences. Family offices can be far more nimble in many cases, and also perhaps more prepared to embrace innovation. But we're going to delve in. I'm not going to introduce the speakers because I think you know who they are. So the question I'd ask really, and as we have experts that cover the sovereign side, the family office side, the pension side, feel free, esteemed panelists, to answer it from whichever perspective you would like. So the open question, perhaps to start with, is what do we think family offices can learn from sovereign wealth funds? And what can sovereign wealth funds learn from family offices? Just on my left, if we can go straight to you, Uche, for that.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Edward. I think I'll probably speak from the perspective of what I think sovereign wealth funds can learn from family offices. And there are 3 points I probably want to make on this. I think the first is the two different pools of capital obviously have different reporting lines and accountability lines. And so the risk appetite and the way you respond to certain opportunities are very different. And as a consequence, you find that sovereign wealth funds tend to be ponderous and take time to make decisions, and that's just because you spend more time trying to avoid making mistakes and because of the complexity of the people you account to. And family offices don't do that. Well, I'm not saying they don't are careful about the risk, but they're faster to make decisions. And I think what ends up happening is large sovereign wealth funds tend to come in a little bit later at great opportunities. They react more slowly. I think the first thing we want to learn from the other is speed, because regardless of the complexity of running a sovereign wealth fund, you could still make the organization nimble and quick. So that's the first thing they can learn. The second thing I think that they can learn is, and I think there's a lot to learn in terms of how you manage risk in the way family offices do, with the type of investment that they can take by being a little bit early in some things. And you find the sovereign wealth funds, they may create a venture fund, but the venture fund will still end up being very slow. The reality is, I think the risk appetite and the way you analyze new opportunities, you tend to find family offices a lot faster, and I think it's something sovereign wealth funds can learn. And I think finally, the third thing that sovereign wealth funds can learn, in my opinion, is managing the diversity of different aspects of investing. Because when I look at a family office portfolio, it's got real estate, it's got new tech, it's got all kinds of things in it. Sovereign wealth funds may have to learn to have the multidisciplinary capability in each of their individual staff, or as many of their staff as possible, to allow them to be adaptable across various sectors. So these are the three differences I see in the way the investing of both types of capital operate, and I think there's a lot for sovereign wealth funds to learn from family offices in terms of how they operate.
Yep, no, very good. So in terms of building up the internal expertise, it's an important part of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that's very good. Well, thank you for that detailed response. Anna, I want to draw on and build on Uche's comments, particularly on the nimbleness, the speed of maybe embracing innovation and sustainable development, importantly. So perhaps from your perspective, and very much looking again at sovereign funds, maybe to tell us a little bit more about how they're able to act as catalysts for this important element of innovation, but specifically in the sustainable development sphere, please.
Of course. Well, sovereign wealth funds are truly in a great position to make an impact and change for the amount of money that they are able to manage. And of course, their sole responsibility in the mandate is to ensure, first of all, the returns to their citizens. But that does not mean that the way that they operate should not be responsible, and it should not concentrate on ESG and sustainable development goals going forward. As we approach COP28 in the next couple of weeks, the conversation is about sustainable finance. This finance is the main pillar of the COP that's ahead of us. And what is important to understand that sustainable development is at the very heart of sovereign wealth fund investment. It has to be, because these are generational funds. And they're very acutely aware that, especially in places where the resources are scarce, and these are funds that will eventually run out of the resources, they have to diversify, they have to take opportunities where societies and communities are put first. Because in investment, it is important to make sure that the community is taken care of. It is much cheaper for the governments to deal with issues where the communities are willing to participate in the development and sustainability going forward. So in reality, what will happen according to the research that I'm looking at, and I very much hope that it will be the reality, is a simple thing, ESG, and we might call it...
Could we have the microphone on?
Okay, am I back? Okay, good. It's very simple, to put it in other words. As we use ESG, which is a term that a lot of individuals think is overused, and perhaps sometimes greenwashing and gender washing comes under it. But ESG is really ingrained. It's ingrained in communities. It's ingrained in investment, and it's ingrained in the companies that put their money forward towards the business. We have to think for profit going ahead, but we also have to think pro-community going ahead. And that is the most important highlight that I think sovereign wealth funds are thinking about, and they understand the importance of taking care of their citizens going forward.
Thank you, Anna. That's, I think, rightly to focus on ESG more broadly, but also the S, which is a critical part of that. Maybe we can follow the theme and look perhaps also at the G. So, Jacques, an industry veteran, originally from Canada, and having been in a position of great responsibility at Immerse, perhaps if you could give us an overview of the strengths and relative weaknesses of sovereign funds, public funds in particular, on the private capital investment side, and then if we can link that, if we may, on how these funds tackle issues surrounding governance in particular.
Sure. Sure. Hopefully I can be, yeah, I think Just on your first question, though, following through, because I agree with the comments that have been made by Uchi and Anna, but I do think there's an opportunity for more mature family offices and for more mature sovereign funds as they mature to try and identify where they can, on a relationship basis, all above board, of course, at all times, actually partner in their respective home markets. I think they're just listening. It's not answering the question that was put to you, Uchi, but I think there is an opportunity as they mature to actually partner and develop very healthy co-investment relationships, each leading in its home market. Yep. In terms of Edward, thanks for that question. In terms of my experience with sovereign wealth funds, and of course, which fund are you talking about? So China Investment Corp, and I'm not picking on them, but it's quite different than Texas Permanent University Fund or Alaska Permanent. So depending on who, or GIC, and the fund that you established and led. So each one, I think, has to receive the focus and attention when you're considering having a co-investment relationship with them, or bringing them into an investment partnership structure, very micro, deal by deal, asset by asset analysis. If they're investing as an LP, different story. You don't have to get into their governance structure. But if they're coming in to actually have a seat at the table, which is a seat that you want them to have at the table, then I think you have to understand their governance structure. And Uchi, you touched on this earlier. I've lived this, good, the bad, and the ugly at times. Overall good, but if you are, whether you're a family office or the asset division, or asset allocation division, or otherwise, of a pension fund, or whether you're a private sector investment manager on the street, you have to know that you're dealing, if we're all in these roles, we're all supposed to be at the table, that when I turn to my colleague and we're trying to solve an issue, that I can get an answer. The deal is live. You have to be live. If you're going back to a committee or to someone who has not sufficiently empowered you, that's a struggle, and that could be a deal breaker and an embarrassment in the marketplace, which from a brand, one's brand when you walked into the room, one's brand when you walk out of the room, you're always trying to come forward with that brand, and people recognizing when they deal with you, this is, they've got someone they can rely upon. So I think it comes down to, and I'll just leave at this point in the discussion, to the empowerment of the people representing the sovereign fund, just as it boils down to the empowerment of the individuals representing a pension fund or a family office. The one last point I would make, large distinction, which often is viewed as being a negative by, I would say, less experienced, less informed individuals when talking about a sovereign fund versus an institutional pension fund, is because of the political nexus. The linkage of that sovereign fund to its home government, to the government policies, the risk of change politically in that jurisdiction, so on and so forth. And while that may be perceived as a negative, it also can be a very big positive. I think I'm running out of time. Just table that for further thought, and happy to discuss it here, or if we run out of time, afterwards. Those are my comments.
Thank you, Jack, and that to finish on one of those very important differences, and to look at how the family offices perhaps are evolving. So I'll maybe connect a couple of questions together for Ambassador at the end here on my left. Perhaps thinking about some of the biggest challenges that family offices face, particularly on the investment side. You're based in the UAE, Ambassador. You're meeting not just with sovereign funds, but also family offices. And in some parts of the world, family offices, sovereign funds, there's not always as much of a difference, not just in size, but also in the way that they can operate. So in terms of the challenges, and to link it also to Jacques' point, are the family offices that you're working with becoming more sophisticated? Is the gap between family offices and sovereign funds shrinking in your sphere of influence?
Edward, thank you. It's a very good question. The challenge is that more than 60% of the global GDP come from the family office businesses. So it's such a vital component of the global economy. But yet, the importance given to running family businesses mainly very ad hoc rather than corporate. So that's very much at the discretion of the father or uncle or so on. That creates quite a lot of difficulties in running a global family as a competitive organization. So that's the challenge part. But being executive coach, what I have done is I built a model. I spent about 10 years building a 6-pillar model. How do you navigate a company, enterprise rather, for sustainable management of a family business? So the 6 pillars which I kind of developed first is the strategy competency part. How do you build a strategy thinking, the roadmaps, the strategic plans and corporate strategy and so on. So once you have that idea embedded into the family, there's a chance because then you can share your vision among your family members, your cousins and so on. The second pillar is the execution capability of the family. The strategic plans or the roadmaps, how do you execute? How deep are you in terms of knowledge, know-how, and the cohesiveness? So that's the second I focus as a coach. Third is getting the right talent, because sometimes the selection criteria is not as sophisticated as a corporate. So that's the third. The fourth pillar is intellectual stimulation in the organization, which is the new talent and the existing talent. How do you intellectually stimulate them to run a global company scientifically? The fifth is the most important, the personal proficiency, because without personal proficiency, it's very difficult to run any organization. The personal brand and the ethics and the meritocracy and so on. And the sixth pillar is the succession plan. So when I fix these 6 areas that I work with some top families, then I saw the huge difference. And also what I did was I took the family members, maybe 20 to 35 in the businesses. I built a 3-year plan for each and every one, which give them a clear direction of where they want to go. Because what happened is that the father or uncle told them to go and work in a place where they never had a plan. Usually in a troubled place, where in the company, they decide to go and ask them to go and work, where they had no expertise. That was the biggest challenge. By bringing everyone to a platform where the enterprise can be run cohesively, and then I think that I could eradicate that particular challenge. And I saw in my own eyes how effectively the family business became as a result of this 6-pillar and thinking. So I think it's very, very important that we focus and we build family businesses very scientifically. Thank you, Edward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And that's a very good point at which to mark the halfway mark in our this afternoon's conversation. So maybe perhaps thinking about some of your comments earlier, Jay, on the risk or the approach to risk, the risk appetite, and also the speed in which change perhaps or diversity can be embraced. This is an open question to all panelists, and perhaps to think about it from the perspective of the funds that you've worked with, examined, to maybe give us some examples. We've heard some wonderful pitches today from a whole diverse ecosystem of companies, but to think about how the funds, in your experience, have really bolstered entrepreneurial landscapes and and promoted innovation across different sectors. Can you give us any specific examples that really stand out from your experience? Can we start perhaps with Anna?
Of course, absolutely. What I find interesting is that sovereign wealth funds, of course, have developed tremendously through the talent that they have acquired in their managerial teams over the last decade or so, and they have a lot of homegrown talent. The funds that are able to invest inwardly are really taking care of the education of the youth and future management teams. The funds that are not able to do so and whose mandate states clearly that they are only able to invest outwardly, such as the Norwegian fund, of course, develop very different strategies in terms of what it is that they look for and how they're going to go forward with development of innovation. So they truly look into different projects of universities, which is wonderful to hear. They're looking at social entrepreneurship, but unfortunately, they are not keen to look at cooperatives and mutually owned businesses. And I think that is an oversight. As we go forward, I believe both sovereign wealth funds and family offices, because of the sustainability element that they consider in the investments, have to look at alternative investment models, which perhaps would have been considered very unorthodox a year or two or even 10 years back. As we look at giving back to society and putting in the environmental, social, and governance factor into the way that we invest, it is important to understand that without making sure that communities are okay, innovation is not going to happen. Because when we are worried and concerned about the well-being, healthcare, education, you are not going to get communities worrying about how to create an innovative technique or an innovative business, because they want to make sure that safety, security, and human rights come first.
Sure.
Thank you. And then perhaps thinking about some of the Canadian funds, I think they've done or seem to have done a very good job of building up that internal capacity so that we have more expertise coming up, more efficient way of investing, less outsourced. Has that been the case in your experience, Jack? And how has that been linked in the medium term to embracing innovation?
Yeah, that's the, in Canada, referred to sometimes as the maple leaf model. And a number of the larger pension funds do direct, and have been doing this now for decades, direct investing with their own asset management teams. And so that is part of the picture. In terms of your first question, though, I'm going to come, that Anna has responded. I thought, and your last question, there are two examples. One large pension fund manager in Canada is in Quebec, the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, which manages pension funds for about 36 Quebec-based public pensions for the almost all of them are. And it was created in the 1960s, so it arguably, people think of it as a pension fund manager, but it's arguably a bit of a quasi-sovereign fund, because, let's put it this way, it's not a red phone, but there's a blue phone between the CEO's office at the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec and the Premier's office. So what they've done, I think this was your question, Edward, what they have done historically is they would pick an entrepreneur with a good idea and that would be beneficial for their economy, and then back that entrepreneur with some discipline, including some experience on his board, lots of capital, and go. So that's one example in Canada that I'm familiar with, and have worked a lot extensively over the decades with that particular institution. At Immerse, actually the question when it relates to innovation that you've asked is interesting for me, because my role at Immerse, the fourth largest Canadian pension fund, was to, among other things, create, and we did, Immerse Ventures, which was a direct investment platform directed, and I'm not going to call it Silicon Valley, but a mini Canadian-based Silicon Valley model. We actually did that on my watch. I didn't do it. I recruited the individual to head up that initiative, and he and the team did an outstanding job for a pension fund to do that. I would say one last comment on your question. It's really difficult, and this has been touched on by all speakers, but you listening to it, you touched on this in terms of the communication skills within a family office in your experience. Imagine the communication skills between someone who's working as a fiduciary investment manager at an institutional public pension fund, or here in the States, one of the state funds, investment funds, and the entrepreneur. Just imagine that conversation. We could all be in the room or on the wall listening. It's and the risk appetite of the two individuals. So I'm not sure how much real world experience there is, which has been positive. It's challenging.
Let me go on this. Yeah.
So I think, Uche, you'd like to pick up on that, but also maybe just a point on your experience in Nigeria, looking at a developing economy. In many ways, you're able to act quicker. You're not basing decisions perhaps on the technological side on existing infrastructure. You can actually embrace change perhaps at a more rapid pace in terms of new areas as well.
Yes, and you can embrace change, but I think what's even more fascinating is that you have to build the infrastructure in developing markets, and I think in some ways that's really helpful, because sovereign wealth funds in developing markets like Nigeria had to play more of a developmental role. So there are three roles sovereign wealth funds play. The first is stabilization. If you have a big enough reserve, you can help stabilization of the economy. Two is savings. And third, and more recently, you're finding funds like the ones in Nigeria also play a developmental role in terms of direct investments in infrastructure. And I think in emerging markets, you realize that everything is to do. And the first thing that really changes in the psychology in the sovereign wealth fund is you have to do it. If you don't, nobody's going to do it.
Yeah.
So you lead by example.
No, you just have to do it because nobody else, it doesn't exist. And I think that is on the one hand both fascinating and also challenging, and an opportunity for us. So there are maybe 2 or 3 case studies to the point about how this drives entrepreneurialism, and I would talk to. The first was in Nigeria. One of the first investments we made, and I think it's an area nobody talks about, is education. And it was in primary school education. So we partnered with a group called Bridge International Academies to provide tools to primary schools. They were not necessarily in fancy buildings, but every teacher got trained and they used an iPad and a cell phone. And the curriculum was centrally located in Washington, D.C., and they were sent to these teachers who were now trained to use those tools to teach kids of the really, really underprivileged in society. And I'm getting somewhere with this story. And these are kids whose parents earn less than $2 a day. What happened was we were instantly able to, at the moment we have about 250,000 students when I left the NSIA in this scheme. But you're finding the underprivileged kids with investment in technology able to get the same quality of education as kids in Washington, D.C. What that resulted in was the entrance level results of these children were now at levels higher than the children of the elite. And this was a tiny investment for the NSI. It was $5 million to build this system. And of course, alongside with Gates Foundation, a few other people. And that has turned education on its head at the primary school level. The second area where we found quite interesting role is so we invested in seven indirect investment sectors: agriculture, toll roads, power, healthcare, financial markets infrastructure, and what we call gas industrialization. Let me speak to what we did with financial markets infrastructure. We realized that venture capital, private equity was really nascent, and we took a decision that we were going to help capitalize this industry. We sponsored and invested in more than 40 funds to create that sector. Now, obviously with mixed results in some places, but I think what meant was that we started to see capital getting formed and created. Third subsector, I think this is final one, and I'm going to speak to this, is toll roads. One of the roles you play, talk about unleashing entrepreneurialism, entrepreneurial spirit in these countries. We realized that there was a lot of waste in the way governments handled direct investments in big infrastructure, and we decided to play a role in it. And for the first time in the history of Nigeria, I think large infrastructure projects like toll roads were finished on time and on budget, because you bring discipline around it. But what was interesting was just the level of people that were able to bring in into some of these sectors, to bring new technologies in terms of how things were done. So I think the role sovereign wealth funds can play, especially in emerging markets, goes beyond just being stabilization or savings. The direct investment element could be a very powerful tool to drive our levels of innovation. I do just one last thing, and I think I'm conscious of time here, and I'll just go very quick. Technology. For us in Nigeria was important that we unleash the potential to train people. And so one of the things that we found missing were cable landing stations, high capacity cable that made cost of internet cheaper. When I moved to Nigeria in 2011, the cost per megabyte was 7 times more expensive than New York City. And we worked with Google to land the Equiano cable in the country. We're now building out loads of data centers across the country, and suddenly you're seeing the cost per megabyte drop. Now, and by the way, all of these investments were profitable, way above our normal benchmark for investing. So I think you can do good and make money in some of these places by embracing the developmental role that certain sovereign wealth funds can play. Some have restrictions, they can't make direct investments domestically, but if you can, embrace that role, and I think it could be very powerful for us for good.
And as you say, these don't have to be marquee investments, they don't have to be giant, shiny buildings. They can be in deeply practical, hugely necessary areas like education, but that can make an enormous impact. So that's, I think that's absolutely important. Speaking of education, we have an educator at the end, someone who's looked at this area. Ambassador, on the family office side and in the Middle East, also conscious of time, can you give us a few recent examples of where the family offices you've worked with have been looking into this area of innovation? They can be faster paced, they can look at technology, they're looking at AI. Is this something that keeps them awake at night? Is there a difference between one generation and the other in terms of their appetite for embracing these new areas?
Edward, I think it's a very good question. I think without getting innovation to a system with the family offices or corporate, I don't think they could survive anymore. So the young generation of family offices have brought in this AI and all these concepts. But what I'm noticing is the elder generation is adapting it very fast, and they are getting more and more keen about this. And that's a very good sign, because the adaptability of the AI and innovation is very well accepted by the elderly, the board members and so on, where the young generation is leading. So I think innovation part is very clear cut for everybody. Without innovation, no competitive advantage. And I think in that aspect, I feel that family office is going to change with a lot of dynamism, adapting to the current market demands and conditions, and will be a force. So the 60% current GDP contribution from global family offices could be an increase rather. So I think in that aspect, I think is a good news that we see the family offices are very much innovation friendly and also AI and technology friendly. Thank you, Edward.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to be very strict with the timing, so I don't think we have time for questions from the floor, unless one person would like to pose a yes or no question to everybody. So I'd say in summary, I've learned a lot. I think there's been a number of highly useful but also really interesting points. Uche, your 3 S's, if I may, the stabilization, purpose, the savings, obviously, elements, and the sustainable development. So I'll take that away as some of the 3 most important reasons why these funds exist. Ambassador, I didn't appreciate, I think perhaps others did, this idea that 60% of global GDP comes from family businesses, which is clearly very important, and it's, I think, an area of pride, as particularly from SWFI, we've seen our pedigree and background over the last 16 years or so in focusing on sovereign funds, public pensions, is to now have the family offices, as they become more sophisticated, be at the same table. It's a hugely useful development. Now, Jacques, I'm not picking up on the most insightful thing that you said, but I really like the idea of these different coloured phones and the fact that they're not red, but a calming blue, a very stable Canadian influence there on that. It might have made your heart flutter if the blue phone started to ring, but I think that's a really good one. As well as obviously the importance of G in ESG, and I think one of the pioneers, and really good to say that from Anna's work, the S, which is somehow underappreciated perhaps in ESG, is now coming to the fore. So something for everybody. Looking at the clock, we've done exceptionally well. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. We can have questions later on. There's multiple dinners, you'll hear all about those. So those questions that you've been preparing, I think we can safely say that everybody here on the stage will be more than pleased to elaborate on any answers in more detail. But please join me in a rousing round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much.